As an official inspector from the Intergalactic Health and Safety Council, my life was built on precision, order, and cleanliness. In my culture, the trial, every citizen is taught from a young age to fear contamination. Our training is strict, emphasizing sterility above all else. A single foreign particle could be the end of us. Our species has evolved with a heightened sensitivity to pathogens, and we've developed an array of impressive protocols to protect ourselves. We have airlocks, cleansing chambers, and every surface of our habitat is purged regularly. I'd inspected environments from ammonia-based planets to slime-filled stations, and I believed I had seen it all. When the Council called me in for an assignment briefing on the new galactic members, Earth and its humans, I hardly batted an eye. Humans were said to be curious and primitive, not especially dangerous, except for their strange diets and lower sanitation standards. The human culture files described them as a hardy species, with an unnaturally diverse array of habitats and bizarre tolerance to environmental contaminants. They were known for eating organic substances, vegetables, meats, processed grains, many items that we trial wouldn't let within light years of our systems. As I walked into the briefing room, my supervisor, Counselor Zeril, was waiting for me, a peculiar look on his face. Zeril was generally unreadable, his thin, translucent skin barely showing any expression, but I could tell he was amused. "Ah, Inspector Zartan," he said, his voice calm. "I have a special assignment for you." "Yes, Counselor Zeril?" I replied, my antennae straightening in anticipation. "As you know, Earth has recently joined the Galactic Coalition, and the Council is keen on ensuring all aspects of their integration go smoothly." He paused, clearly relishing his next words. "Including their kitchens?" "Kitchens?" I echoed, uncertain if I'd misheard. Kitchens were where alien species prepared their food, and every species we'd encountered followed a more or less universal standard. Temperature controls, sealed environments, air purifiers, waste disposal. Food was carefully regulated to avoid spoilage or contamination. This assignment, however, seemed trivial. "Yes, Inspector," Zeril continued, as though sensing my skepticism. "Humans, it appears, have a rather unique relationship with food and its preparation. We require a full inspection of their kitchens to ensure that they meet basic intergalactic health standards. And who better to conduct this evaluation than our most thorough inspector?" I felt a swell of pride. The Council was entrusting me with a delicate mission, one that would define humanity's culinary standards in the galaxy. "I accept the assignment," I said confidently, mentally preparing myself for what I thought would be a routine inspection. "Very well, Inspector. The humans have assigned a guide for you. She will provide access to her home kitchen and answer any questions you might have." Zeril looked as though he was holding back laughter, his thin mouth twitching. "And do remember, Zyartan, humans are known for their resilience. Their immune systems are capable of enduring conditions that would be considered extreme by our standards." His words lingered in my mind as I prepared for the journey to Earth. I studied all known materials about humans and their food, their use of spices and oils, their methods of frying and grilling. I thought I was ready. I thought nothing could surprise me. 2 days later, I landed in a small Earth city, where I was met by a human government representative, a man named Lee, who seemed overly cheerful and unfazed by the unusual circumstances. He led me to a modest dwelling in a neighborhood filled with more of these human homes. Each home was unique, decorated with plant life, and seemed designed for maximum individuality. "Welcome, Inspector Zyartan," Lee said as we reached a small house. "We'll be conducting the inspection in one of our typical family kitchens. The owner, Sarah, has been very accommodating and is ready to assist you." I nodded, reviewing my notes one last time, when the door opened and a human woman stepped out with a welcoming smile. She was holding some kind of drinking vessel, emitting steam. The smell wafted toward me, warm, bitter, and alien. "Inspector," she greeted me. Come in. You're my first intergalactic guest. I can't tell you how excited I am to show off a real human kitchen." Her smile was wide, and I sensed a strange eagerness in her tone, as though she were about to share some grand secret. With Lee behind me, I cautiously entered her dwelling. The house itself was strange, filled with colors, objects, and sounds that seemed out of place in a professional environment. There were paintings and odd photographs on the walls. Soft fabric covered various surfaces, and the air was filled with a symphony of scents, each distinct and somehow woven together. Finally, we arrived at the kitchen. Sarah gestured around proudly, and I took in the sight before me. The first thing that struck me was the sheer clutter. Every surface seemed occupied by something: a machine, a utensil, or strange containers filled with unknown substances. I noted the appliances: a microwave, a toaster, an oven, and a refrigerator. Each one seemed old, almost haphazardly designed, and none were sealed or sterilized by our standards. "Well, go ahead, Inspector," Sarah said cheerfully. "Feel free to look around. This kitchen has everything a human needs to make a good meal." Nervously, I approached the first device, the microwave. I was familiar with devices that used radiation to sterilize objects. I assumed this was similar. I opened the door cautiously and was horrified to find dried, crusted specks of food coating the interior. "What is this?" I asked, gesturing at the interior walls of the microwave, my antennae curling instinctively in alarm. "Oh, that's—" Sarah shrugged, giving the interior a quick glance. "It's just some spaghetti sauce from a while back. I cleaned it off as best I could, but, well, you know how it is." No, I did not know how it was. In my culture, a single speck of contamination would mean immediate decontamination. But here, in this human kitchen, it seemed that contamination was accepted, ignored even. I made a note on my inspection device, marking the first of what I assumed would be many infractions. Next, I approached a device called a toaster, which appeared to be designed for heating bread. Its interior was littered with a strange black substance. I ran my scanner over it, and my device identified it as burnt bread particles, also known as crumbs. This device was unclean. I reached for a nearby counter to steady myself, unsure if I could continue. "Is this standard?" I asked, my voice faint. "Oh yeah," Sarah replied, chuckling. "You'll find crumbs in every toaster on Earth. They're a pain to clean out." I noted her nonchalance and forced myself to continue. Next, I approached the oven, a larger device with an even stronger smell. When I opened it, I was hit by an odor that seemed to combine elements of carbon, grease, and a mysterious burned substance fused to the floor of the oven. "Ah, don't mind that," Sarah said with a wave. "It's just a bit of, well, I guess pizza remnants. Adds flavor to the next meal. You know?" "Flavor?" My antennae pulsed in alarm, signaling danger. In my culture, anything left behind would be considered toxic. But here it seemed humans left residues deliberately. I documented this with a sense of growing dread. Finally, I moved to the refrigerator, a device that Sarah claimed was perfectly clean. I opened it and was greeted by a wave of cold air, carrying a multitude of unfamiliar scents, sweet, sour, and pungent. Inside, I saw a bewildering assortment of jars and containers, some half-filled, some marked with strange labels. And then I saw it, a piece of bread covered in green and black spots. "What is this?" I asked, pointing, horrified. "Oh, that's just moldy bread," she said casually. "I forgot it was in there. No big deal." "No big deal?" My training told me that mold was one of the most dangerous forms of contamination known. But here it was almost treated as an afterthought. I made another note, feeling as though I were in some surreal nightmare. As I finished my initial examination, I turned back to Sarah, my mind reeling. "Humans live with these conditions?" She chuckled, her expression proud. "Yep, and we're all the stronger for it. You get used to a little dirt and bacteria. It keeps the immune system strong." I could hardly believe it. Where I came from, any contamination was a cause for alarm. But here, humans saw it as a strength. For the first time, I understood why Earth kitchens were quarantined. They were chaos incarnate, defying every principle of hygiene and safety I had ever known. Yet somehow, inexplicably, humans survived. And as I prepared my report, I realized with growing dread that I had only begun to scratch the surface of Earth's most baffling and hazardous enigma. I returned to the kitchen the next morning, determined to approach this inspection with a clear mind. I reminded myself that, as an inspector from the Intergalactic Health and Safety Council, I had a duty to remain objective and professional, no matter how unconventional this human kitchen seemed. I forced myself to ignore the instinctive horror I felt as I remembered the moldy bread, the burnt particles, and the crusted food remnants. "Good morning, Inspector." Sarah greeted me with her usual cheerful smile. She gestured for me to come in, once again holding that peculiar steaming cup from the day before. I hesitated, the strange, bitter aroma triggering a warning signal in my antennae, but I composed myself and followed her in. "So, where would you like to start today?" she asked, taking a long sip from her drink. I could see her eyes light up with what I could only describe as an unsettling enthusiasm. I looked around, noting the countless surfaces and objects that still needed to be inspected. There was no shortage of mysteries in this kitchen, but I decided to begin with something that seemed straightforward, a device Sarah had called a blender. In theory, this seemed harmless, a machine designed to mix food quickly, presumably for efficient nutrient consumption. As I approached it, I noticed a faint, sticky residue coating the base and blades. The color was a sickly mix of greens and browns, with dried specks that clung stubbornly to the interior. My inspection scanner flashed with a low-level contamination warning. I recoiled. "Is this device often cleaned?" I managed to ask, though my voice trembled slightly. "Oh yes, of course," Sarah replied, seemingly unfazed. "After every use, we rinse it out. But, sometimes bits get stuck in there, especially when you blend spinach or blueberries. It's hard to get everything off." I swallowed, the concept of rinse barely computing. In trial kitchens, our sterilization procedures involved vaporizing any residue and sanitizing every surface with a chemical wash. Anything less was unthinkable. Here, humans were content to simply rinse. I noted the infraction and moved to the countertop. To my astonishment, Sarah had lined up an array of items she called seasonings and spices, along with bottles of oils and vinegars. Each container looked suspect. I picked up a glass jar filled with dark flecks and shook it gently. "That's pepper," Sarah explained, "one of the most popular spices. It really brings flavor to a dish." Flavor. There was that word again. I'd read about the concept of flavor, the human practice of enhancing food to make it more pleasurable, but I hadn't understood how far they were willing to go. Pepper, according to my scanner, contained compounds that triggered irritation in many species. Yet here it was on prominent display, as if humans actively sought out such discomfort. I moved to the salt next. I knew what salt was. Many species used it in trace amounts for nutrient balance. But this jar held an alarming quantity. I scanned it, and my device informed me that this much salt could easily incapacitate a trial. Yet humans seem to apply it liberally to their meals. "Do you use these substances regularly?" I asked, unable to mask my bewilderment. "Oh, absolutely," Sarah replied, her smile growing. "Salt, pepper, garlic powder, paprika, you name it. Different flavors for different moods." The word powder caught my attention. I picked up a small red container labeled paprika and looked inside. It was a fine red dust, a pungent and spicy aroma wafting from it. My scanner blared an alert, identifying it as an irritant. I nearly dropped it in shock. Sarah laughed, noticing my reaction. "Oh, you're sensitive to spices, huh? That's just paprika. Gives a bit of a kick. Here, smell this," she said, handing me a jar labeled curry powder. My antennae curled in self-defense, but I steeled myself and took a cautious whiff. Instantly, I was overwhelmed by an intense, complicated aroma, a mix of spices that seemed to both attract and repel me. My sensory organs tingled, and I took an involuntary step back. "Humans ingest this willingly?" I asked, my voice a faint whisper. "Of course," Sarah said, grinning. "It's delicious. We use spices in almost everything." It was clear to me now. Humans actively sought to overwhelm their senses with these compounds. I made detailed notes, flagging each spice as a potential hazard, then moved on to another corner of the kitchen. A rack of metal and wooden implements caught my eye, objects of various shapes and sizes. There were knives, tongs, spoons, and spatulas. Most of them had traces of dried residue. I ran my scanner over the utensils and frowned as the contamination warnings popped up. "How often do you clean these?" I asked, dreading the answer. "Oh, every night," she replied cheerfully. "Sometimes bits get stuck on there, but it's no big deal. And if we're in a rush, we just give them a quick rinse." I could feel my antennae pulsing with mounting distress. Each response seemed to reveal a new level of tolerance for what we would consider contamination. Bits of food left on utensils, crusted spices on jars, residues in machines. For the trial, these practices were equivalent to inviting disaster. As I moved to inspect the sink, I noticed something that made me freeze: a damp, slightly wrinkled cloth lying on the countertop. My instinct screamed at me to avoid it, but my duty compelled me to investigate. I picked up the scanner, running it over the cloth, and my display filled with red alerts. "What is this?" I asked, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "Oh, that's just the dishcloth," Sarah replied with a casual shrug. "We use it to wipe down the counters." I struggled to process this. The cloth, which my scanner identified as a bacterial hotspot, was used to clean. It was soaked with food particles, oils, and, alarmingly, several strains of bacteria that would trigger a sanitation alert on any council-certified vessel. Is this cloth replaced?" I asked weakly, hoping for some assurance that this contamination was temporary. "Replaced? Not unless it's really gross," she said, laughing. "Otherwise, we just rinse it out and let it dry." This, I realized, was beyond my comprehension. I could feel my professionalism fraying, my carefully trained resolve buckling under the sheer madness of it all. I added the dishcloth to my growing list of concerns, each item a testament to the reckless resilience of humans. Determined to complete this inspection, I made my way to the final area, the pantry. It was a small closet, filled with shelves that bowed under the weight of cans, boxes, and jars. I scanned the first item, something labeled spam. My device struggled to categorize it, and after several seconds, it gave up, flashing an error. The ingredients, it seemed, defied all classification. "Spam," Sarah said fondly. "A classic. You gotta try it sometime." "I don't believe I could survive that," I replied, genuinely concerned for her species. I reached for another item, a brightly colored package labeled Twinkies. Again, my scanner was confounded. The ingredient list included chemicals that were typically used as preservatives or in industrial applications. Yet humans consumed it as food. "How long does this remain edible?" I asked. "Twinkies? Oh, years and years," Sarah replied, laughing. "They say they'd survive an apocalypse." An apocalypse? That was perhaps the most fitting description for this kitchen. A chaotic ecosystem of overlapping hazards that humans somehow navigated with ease. They had created substances that defied time, flavors that challenged the senses, and tools that seemed to collect contamination as if it were a badge of honor. By the time I finished inspecting the pantry, my report was overflowing with notes, each infraction more baffling than the last. I could no longer deny the truth. Human kitchens were not simply a deviation from galactic standards. They were a realm of chaos, a landscape of potential hazards that would annihilate most species. As I prepared to leave, Sarah noticed my expression and laughed. "You look a little shell-shocked, Inspector. Humans like a little grit, you know? Builds character. You can't be too clean in a kitchen. It's where life happens." Her words echoed in my mind as I stepped back, mentally reviewing my findings. This was not just a kitchen. It was a testament to humanity's strange and baffling resilience. In every corner, there were remnants of past meals, traces of culinary adventures, and evidence of a species that thrived in the presence of chaos. I realized now why the Council had placed human kitchens under quarantine. It wasn't just a precaution, it was a necessity. For in these kitchens, humans engaged in practices that defied logic, standards, and sometimes even common sense. And yet, they survived, even thrived. As I exited, I glanced back at Sarah, who was smiling proudly, completely unbothered by the environment that had shaken me to my core. And in that moment, I understood a new truth. Humans were as indomitable as their kitchens were chaotic. After 2 full days of inspection, I sat down in Sarah's kitchen, mentally exhausted. I had documented every baffling discovery, every unsanitary practice, every chaotic element that humans embraced with what seemed like reckless enthusiasm. As I reviewed my notes, the sheer scope of their food preparation practices began to overwhelm me. This was beyond any conceivable standard. Human kitchens were a realm where logic, health protocols, and survival instincts seemed to collide. I took a deep breath, mentally reciting my training: observe, document, analyze without prejudice. I'd always considered myself calm and professional, but this assignment had stretched my resilience to its limits. Sarah noticed my dazed expression and chuckled. "You look like you've been through the ringer," she said, offering me a small object wrapped in paper. "Here, try this. It's a chocolate bar. A little treat for your trouble." I accepted the object, glancing at it warily. The paper wrapper crinkled as I peeled it back, revealing a dark brown, glossy surface. My scanner identified it as chocolate, a confection made from the seeds of a terrestrial plant. Tentatively, I took a small nibble. The flavor was astonishing. A rush of sweetness mixed with complex, bitter notes flooded my senses. It was unlike anything I had tasted, both overwhelming and oddly comforting. In that moment, something about human cuisine became clear to me. Despite all the chaos and disregard for cleanliness, there was a kind of artistry, a pursuit of pleasure that defied rationality. They didn't merely eat for sustenance. They sought out experiences, sensations, and, strangely enough, joy. I set the chocolate bar down, feeling a mixture of amazement and horror. I had begun to suspect that human kitchens were not only dangerous, but perhaps uniquely reflective of their entire species. And it was time to put my conclusions to the test. "Sarah," I said, "I need to see a meal prepared from start to finish. I must understand how humans survive this chaos." "Sure thing," Sarah replied enthusiastically, clapping her hands together. "Let's make something simple. How about spaghetti with marinara sauce?" Spaghetti, marinara sauce. I made a mental note to catalog the specifics of this ritual. Sarah pulled ingredients from every corner of the kitchen: pasta from the pantry, a jar of red sauce from the refrigerator, a handful of herbs, and a small container of minced garlic, she called it. Every item seemed to be infused with its own distinctive aroma, filling the air with a heady blend of scents. She began by setting a large metal pot of water on a device called a stovetop. As the water heated, steam began to rise, filling the room with a humid warmth. My antennae detected particles in the steam: minerals, dissolved salts, compounds of unknown origin. It was a chemical cocktail that, by all standards, should not be allowed to circulate freely. And yet, Sarah stood there, breathing it all in with a contented smile. "First, we boil the pasta," she said, dropping dry noodles into the bubbling water. I watched in fascination as the noodles softened, changing shape and texture. Then she moved to the sauce. She poured a thick, red substance into a smaller pot, and I noticed flecks of green and white. Garlic, basil, tomatoes. Each ingredient seemed to bring its own complex chemical profile to the mix. "Would you like to help?" she asked, holding out a wooden spoon. I stared at the spoon, the wooden surface showing faint traces of past sauces. My instinct screamed against it, but I reached out, determined to complete my study. As I took the spoon, the faint residues of previous meals made contact with my sensors. The data was alarming: a mixture of dried oils, microscopic food particles, and traces of bacteria. I stifled a shudder and began to stir the sauce, forcing myself to focus. Meanwhile, Sarah sprinkled something called salt into the water, and my scanner detected a sudden spike in sodium content. She added a splash of olive oil, and the surface of the water shimmered with a thin, oily film. I documented everything, marveling at how humans combined elements that, by trial standards, should have been considered toxic or hazardous. The final result was a bubbling, fragrant concoction that seemed to defy all sense of safety. As she prepared the meal, I noted her casual, almost reckless approach to handling food. She touched surfaces, moved utensils from one pot to another, and tasted directly from the spoon, a practice that would send my species into a full biohazard lockdown. Each step seemed to increase the contamination risk, and yet Sarah moved through it all with a confidence that bordered on madness. Finally, she announced, "It's ready," and scooped the noodles and sauce onto a plate. She added a sprinkle of something she called Parmesan cheese, and the dish was complete. "Go on, give it a try," she urged, setting the plate in front of me. I hesitated, staring at the food. My inspection instincts rebelled, every molecule of my being screaming that this was dangerous, unsanitary, a potential biohazard. And yet, I had committed to understanding the species. Summoning all my courage, I lifted a forkful of the food to my mouth. The taste was overwhelming. The sauce was rich and tangy, with a complexity that left me both intrigued and alarmed. The noodles were soft yet resilient, a texture I'd never encountered. My sensory organs detected layers of flavor. The sharpness of the garlic, the brightness of the basil, the saltiness of the cheese. The experience was baffling, overwhelming, and yet undeniably enjoyable. In that moment, I understood something profound. Humans thrived in chaos. They found joy in disorder, in the unexpected, in flavors that were at odds with one another, yet somehow harmonious. Their kitchens were not merely places to prepare food. They were arenas of exploration, creativity, and resilience. As I set the fork down, I felt a sense of awe mingled with lingering horror. Humans, I realized, were not governed by the same need for order that dictated life for the trial. They didn't fear contamination or disorder. They embraced it, wielding it as a tool to enhance their lives. Sarah watched me expectantly, a smile on her face. "What do you think?" I took a moment to collect myself. "It is unlike anything I've ever experienced," I admitted. Her grin widened. "That's the human kitchen for you. Might be a little messy, but it's always worth it in the end." I left her kitchen that day with my report nearly complete. I had documented every infraction, every deviation from protocol, but I had also come to respect, in a strange way, the resilience and adaptability of humans. They thrived in environments that would be lethal to other species. Their kitchens were a testament to their ingenuity, their defiance of logic, and their stubborn refusal to conform to standards of cleanliness that the rest of the galaxy adhered to. When I returned to the Intergalactic Health and Safety Council, I presented my findings with a sense of gravity. I recommended that all human kitchens remain under strict quarantine protocols, not out of disdain, but for the safety of every other species. Humans, I explained, had evolved in an environment of chaos and potential hazards, and they had adapted to it in ways that defied galactic standards. The council members listened intently, some of them visibly disturbed by my descriptions. As I concluded my report, one counselor asked, "Inspector Zyrton, do you believe humans are dangerous?" I thought about the question carefully before replying. "They are unpredictable," I said. "Their tolerance for contamination is unlike anything I've ever seen. Their kitchens are breeding grounds for what most species would consider biohazards. And yet they thrive. Perhaps danger is too simple a word. Humans are resilient." The council members nodded, murmuring among themselves. As they discussed the quarantine measures, I felt a strange pang of nostalgia. I remembered Sarah's smile, the taste of chocolate, the warmth of the spaghetti sauce. There was something endearing about humanity's defiance of order, their willingness to embrace messiness for the sake of enjoyment. Before I left, Zeril, my supervisor, approached me. "Inspector," he said, his voice carrying a note of amusement, "it seems you've returned with more than just a report." I nodded, uncertain of what to say. "They are strange, counselor, but I see now why they are unlike any other species. They survive in conditions that would overwhelm most, and they do it with a spirit that's difficult to understand." Zeril smiled knowingly. "Welcome to the paradox of humanity." As I left the council chamber, I realized that my view of Earth and its people had changed. Their kitchens, while chaotic and alarming, were a reflection of something deeper, an unyielding will, a refusal to be limited by fear, and a love for life in all its imperfect forms. And perhaps, just perhaps, there was something to learn from that resilience. I filed my final report with a simple recommendation. For safety reasons, human kitchens should remain quarantined, but their spirit is worth studying. They are survivors in a way no species has ever been. And as I returned to my sterile, orderly world, I found myself holding onto the chocolate bar Sarah had given me, as a small reminder of the delicious chaos that lay beyond the stars.